In this chapter, we're going to talk about consumer surplus, producer surplus, and then different ways that a government can intervene in a market. So we'll talk about price floors and ceilings, we'll talk about taxes, a little bit about subsidies. Let's start by thinking about consumer surplus. And remember that consumer surplus, where I'm going to typically abbreviate CS, consumer surplus. And this is going to be a way of measuring the well-being of the buyer's side of a market. So let's go back and just kind of review where consumer surplus comes from and how we calculate it. Let's start by thinking about willingness to pay. So willingness to pay, which I'm going to abbreviate WTP, willingness to pay is how we're going to measure value. How we measure value. So we can look at your willingness to pay. We can see how much you value something by looking at how many dollars you're willing to give up to get it. Okay, so the kind of thought experiment that I use to motivate this in a principles class is to have students consider something that they value. And then think about what would happen if I took it away from them and then they had to pay me to get it back. Well, the more they value it, the more they would be willing to pay to get it back. And so we can use their willingness to pay as a measure of how much they value it. If it's something that they don't value very highly, like a pencil or a pen, they're not going to be willing to pay very much to get it back. But if it's something they do value a lot, then they'd be willing to pay a lot to get it back. On the other hand, we could think about their willingness to accept. So we could think about how many dollars it would require for me to buy it from them, rather than taking it and then ransoming it back, just offering to buy it. And if it's your pen or a pencil, it probably wouldn't take very many dollars before you would be willing to sell it to me. But if it's that thing that you value a lot, well, then it's probably going to require a lot of dollars for me to be able to buy it from you, to get you to part with it. So willingness to pay is how we measure value. And remember that the willingness to pay is exactly what the demand curve tells us. So if we look at an inverse demand curve, we've got a demand curve like we've always thought about them. The way that we typically think about demand curves, at least in a principles class, is we think about the price. So we can think about, say, a price like P1, and then we can go over and see the quantity demanded at that price, Q1. But there's a much more useful way to think about the demand curve, and that is that the height of the demand curve tells us the willingness to pay at the margin for a particular quantity. And so if we think about low quantities down here, when you don't have very much of something, all other things equal, you're willing to pay a lot to get a little bit more of it. On the other hand, when you've already got a lot of something, you're willing to pay relatively less at the margin to get another unit. It's why the first bite at the buffet is always the best bite, right? You get a lot of value from that first bite. But as you continue to take bites, your willingness to pay for another bite diminishes, and by the time you've had enough bites to fill you up, you don't really care that much about the final bites that you end up taking. So the height of the demand curve is representing the marginal willingness to pay. If we look at this quantity Q1, the willingness to pay at the margin is P1. Now, what that means is that this demand curve represents the value that consumers get from the good, and we can figure out the total value that the consumer gets from consuming all of these units of the good up to Q1. The total value is represented by all of the area under the demand curve out to that particular quantity. Now, this is not consumer surplus yet. You should remember from this picture that consumer surplus isn't all of the area under the demand curve. But right now, we're just thinking about value. So here's the value, and if we were to think about increasing the quantity out here, it would add some value, and it would be the additional area under the demand curve. So you can calculate the area, the value here, by just calculating the area of this triangle and adding to it the area of that rectangle to get the total value that this consumer places on Q1. Or if this was a market demand curve, this would be the total value that all of the consumers get from consuming all of these units up to the quantity Q1. Either way, it represents value. Now, the definition of consumer surplus is that it's leftover value after you pay for the goods. So consumer surplus is willingness to pay minus the price that you actually pay. Okay, so if you're willing to pay $20 for something and you end up paying $18, then you get $2 of consumer surplus. You were willing to pay $20 minus the price you paid, which is $18, consumer surplus equals $2. And that's why it's a useful way of measuring the well-being of buyers, because the bigger consumer surplus is, the better off you are. If you were always having to pay a price that's equal to your willingness to pay, then you'd be worse off. Okay? So consumer surplus simply represents value you were willing to give up, but because the price was below your value, you didn't have to give it up, and now you can spend it on something else. It's like surplus value is really the idea behind it. So if we look at this picture, the consumer surplus shows up as this triangle right here, because if we look at all of these units, let's pick a unit like this one, we'll call it Q2. If we look at this quantity, for this particular quantity, the value is way up here, but then the consumer has to pay this price to get it. So they have to give up this much of the value, but that leaves them with this much value left over for that particular unit. And then if we think of another unit infinitesimally close to that unit, well, they're willing to pay a little bit less, they have to pay this amount, and so the amount of value that they get to keep is this area. And then if we think about another unit, and another unit, and another unit, they're always getting to keep this chunk right here, in between the demand curve and the price. And so what we know is that the consumer surplus is represented as the area under the demand curve and above the market price. If here's our demand curve and here's the market price and here's the quantity consumed, then our consumer surplus shows up as this area right there under the demand curve and above the price. And you would calculate that simply as the area of a triangle. Producer surplus, on the other hand, is similar. So producer surplus shows up. You think about a supply curve here. Producer surplus shows up as the area under the price and above the supply curve. So if this is our quantity right here, then our producer surplus shows up as this area. If you don't remember this, then you need to go back to my principles video where I demonstrate how to calculate consumer surplus, and I go into a little bit more about what's going on here and what's behind all of this. But the key things are that you remember that the demand curve represents value and the supply curve represents the cost of production. Cost of production. You've already had your principles class, so you already know that a supply curve, at least in a competitive market, is actually the marginal cost curve. It does indeed represent the cost of production. So if we wanted to think about the total cost of producing all of these units, the total cost of producing all of these units is this area under the supply curve out to this quantity. Now the total amount of money that the sellers get to sell this for is this rectangle right here. Remember that total revenue is equal to price times quantity. This vertical distance is price, this horizontal distance is quantity, and so the area of this rectangle represents total revenue. But the firms don't get to keep all of that. They have to pay this amount down here for their cost of production. And so producer surplus is simply defined as the price minus the cost of production. And again, it shows up as the area under this price line and above the supply curve or the marginal cost curve. So now let's think about using the demand and supply curve that we developed in our previous videos to just go through and do a simple example where we calculate some consumer surplus and producer surplus. So let's use as an example that demand curve where we had quantity demanded is equal to 500 minus 100p, and our supply curve, which is negative 100 plus 100p. And let's suppose that you have to calculate consumer and producer surplus at the equilibrium price. So the task here is to calculate consumer surplus and producer surplus at the equilibrium price. So clearly the first step is that we need to figure out the equilibrium price. So let's do that, and all we need to do, we saw previously, is that we need to set our demand curve equal to our supply curve. We're working with the demand curve and the supply curve here. We could invert these and work with the inverse demand and inverse supply curve. And actually here in just a second, we're going to want to draw a picture of this. Now when we draw the picture, we need to invert this to make sure that we have price solved by itself. So let's go ahead though and figure out our equilibrium price and quantity. So we're going to set demand equal to supply. I'm going to move my 100 over. That gives me 600 here. Then I've got, moving that over, I've got 200p. And we see that p is equal to 3, which is what we saw previously. P is equal to $3. Now we need to figure out our equilibrium quantity, so we can plug that price into either of these. If we plug it into here, then we're going to get 500 minus 100 times 3, which is 300. That gives us a quantity of 200. And that's exactly what we saw. Now let's go ahead and graph these things. So what we want to do is invert them. So let's say we're going to invert, and you need to make sure that anytime you're working on a problem, you're working on a test problem or a homework problem, and you start to draw a picture of a demand curve and a supply curve, you always need to make sure you invert it. If you just graph these lines right here, you're working on it with a different picture than the one you're used to. So you want to make sure that you invert. So let's invert our first one. I'm just going to call this Q. Q is equal to 500 minus 100p. So I'm going to move my 100p over. 500 minus Q, that gives me P is equal to 5 minus Q over 100. There's my inverse demand curve. Let's go ahead and invert the supply curve. Let's do it down here. So Q is equal to negative 100 plus 100p. So I'm going to bring my 100 to the other side, and then I'm going to flip around to the whole thing. So that gives me 100p on one side, and then I get 100 plus Q. I'm going to divide by the 100. That gives me P equals 1 plus Q over 100. And now we can graph these. This is our inverse demand. Here's our inverse supply. We can graph those because they're solved for P. Our intercept of our demand curve, our choke price, is 5. That's right up here. And I'm not going to worry about accurately representing the slope. The slope here is very small, so this thing would be not very steep at all, but that doesn't matter. We're not using the picture to solve for our answers, so I'm just going to give that some downward slope. The intercept of my supply curve, my inverse supply curve, is 1. That's my supply choke price, so it's right here. And this thing looks like that. We solved for our price. It was $3. And our equilibrium quantity was 200 units. So there's what we've solved for so far. We've got the equilibrium price and quantity. What we need to do, though, is we need to calculate consumer and producer surplus at that equilibrium price and quantity. And so let's do that. Let's do it right down here. Let's do consumer surplus. Now, consumer surplus is this area right here, the area under the demand curve and above the price. And so remember, if you're calculating the area of a triangle, it's the vertical distance times the horizontal distance, and then you've got to divide by 2. So it's going to be 2 times 200 and then we have to divide it by 2 because it's half of a rectangle. And so that gives us $200 of consumer surplus. Producer surplus here is going to be the same thing. You can already see. Let's put it down here. Producer surplus is this area. The vertical distance is 2. The horizontal distance is 200, and we've got to divide by 2, so it's 2 times 200 divided by 2 is equal to $200. Now, the reason that our consumer surplus and our producer surplus end up being equal to each other here is simply because of the slopes of the inverse demand and inverse supply curve. They essentially have the same slope, and that means that our equilibrium price is going to fall right in the middle there, and this distance here is going to be equal to that distance there. So don't think that you're always going to have these equal to each other. If I were to change the slope of one of those, then one's going to be bigger than the other. But you can see that calculating consumer and producer surplus is not hard. So what we need to do now is now that we've got this measure of the well-being of buyers in the market and a measure of the well-being of sellers in the market, now we can use this to start figuring out the impact of different government policies. So we can think about a price floor or a price ceiling or a tax, and we can see what it does to consumer surplus. And we can measure how much consumer surplus changes, and then we know exactly whether or not consumers are going to be better off or worse off. So I'll clear this off, and then we'll come back and take a look at that. Let's think now about the effect that price controls have on a market. So we're going to start by thinking about a price ceiling. And remember that a price ceiling is a legislated maximum price. It's a law that is passed that says that it's illegal to buy or sell the good for any price greater than whatever the law specifies, whatever the maximum is, the ceiling. And it's typically passed by politicians to try to protect buyers from high prices. So sometimes in cases of national emergency, certain price controls kick in. And the intention behind those laws, I would argue the intent is good, but the impact of the price ceiling, or we'll see here in a second, or the impact of the price floor is actually bad. It ends up not being good for the people that are involved in the market. It doesn't protect buyers from high prices, at least not all of them. It ends up hurting some at the expense, or helping some at the expense of others. So we'll look at that here in a second. And now that we've talked about consumer and producer surplus, we'll be able to use consumer and producer surplus to measure the impact of price floors and ceilings in a market. So let's start with a price ceiling. I'm just going to briefly remind you that a ceiling can either be binding or non-binding depending upon where the ceiling is related to the equilibrium. So let's start by thinking about a non-binding price ceiling. So let's look at an inverse demand curve here and an inverse supply curve. If I were to put the price ceiling right up here, and the symbol that I typically use for a price ceiling is P with a bar above it. If I were to put the price ceiling right up there, that would be non-binding. And the reason is that the law, in this case, would allow any price below that ceiling. This is what I typically call the allowable range. So the law says it's okay as long as price is in this range, but it can't be above that point. Well, the market wants to take the price to right here, and so this would be non-binding. This would have no impact on the market. So let's just say here, this is a non-binding price floor, or excuse me, non-binding price ceiling. It's not until we place the price ceiling below the equilibrium that it would become binding. So let's draw a quick picture of what that would look like if we had an inverse demand, inverse supply, and we had a price ceiling that was placed right here. If the law said that the price can't go above that point, then our allowable range is anything below it. That's the allowable range. But the market wants to push the price all the way up to here, and that's not allowable. So what's going to happen is the market will push price up as high as it can, but then it can't push it up anymore, so the price will just stay right here. And so let's think about what ends up happening, and you already know that a binding price floor like this one is going to create a shortage. So this is a shortage, and we saw in a previous video that we could easily figure out the amount of the shortage. Here's quantity supplied, and here's quantity demanded. If you were to take, here's quantity supplied, if you were to take this price and plug it into the inverse supply curve, you would get the quantity supplied. And if you took that price and plugged it into the inverse demand curve, you would get the quantity demanded. And the difference between those two would be the amount of the shortage. And the problem with that is, every once in a while I get into a conversation with somebody outside of an economics class, and if the conversation turns to something like price restrictions, price floors, or price ceilings, a lot of times people will say, well, okay, I see why it might cause a shortage, but eventually as everybody gets used to it, that shortage will go away. And the answer to that is no, it won't. If anything, this will be a persistent shortage that will get worse over time. Because what we know is that the elasticity of the demand curve and the supply curve tends to increase over longer time horizons. Demand and supply tend to be more elastic over longer time horizons. So as time goes by, the demand curve and the supply curve flatten out. And as they flatten out, that increases this distance between the inverse demand and inverse supply curves at that price. The shortage will get worse over time, not better. So what ends up happening is that some other rationing mechanism has to emerge. And so if we think about what those other rationing mechanisms are, those are going to be things like lines. Anytime there's a shortage, typically the most common type of rationing mechanism is a line. Very inefficient. A line is a bad way of allocating goods and services because it encourages people to essentially waste time standing in a line or a queue trying to get to the front of it so that they can get the good. And it also rewards people regardless of what, it rewards the wrong people, let's say it that way. It rewards people with a low opportunity cost of time rather than the people who actually place the highest value on the good. So if we think about different types of rationing mechanisms, different types of ways of allocating goods and services, one thing that you'll hear me say frequently is that with a free market, it is price that rations the good. Price rations the good or service. Sometimes I will say it this way, price allocates the good or service. Now let's think about what that phrase means, because that's something that economists say frequently, but unless you really think carefully about what is behind that phrase, you might not understand what's going on. Price doesn't make any decisions. Price is just something that emerges from the market. But let's take a look at what ends up happening in a free market. If we've got an inverse demand curve and an inverse supply curve, what we know is that the price P star emerges from that market. Neither the buyers nor the sellers control that price. In fact, nobody needs to even like that price. Buyers would always wish that the price is lower, and sellers would always wish that the price was higher. But neither of them have any control over it in a competitive market, and so price emerges from the interaction of demand and supply. We're not going to worry about the quantity, but our equilibrium quantity would be right here. Now let's talk about who actually buys and who doesn't buy, and also who sells and who doesn't sell. So if we think about the buyers in this market, the buyers are going to be represented along the demand curve. And remember that the buyers that are represented up here along this portion of the demand curve, these are the buyers with high willingness to pay for the good. They value the good a lot. There are also buyers represented down here along this portion of the demand curve, and they value it relatively little, at least compared to these people. So what ends up happening is this price emerges, and then all of the consumers who value the good more than that price voluntarily choose to buy the good. So the buyers in the market are represented along this segment of the demand curve. These are the buyers. They are the buyers because they get to make their own decision. They buy not because the government told them they could or somebody else told them they could. They buy because they value the good more than the price they're being asked to pay for it. And then these people down here on this portion of the demand curve, from this point here, from the equilibrium down to there, those consumers choose not to buy. So these I'll call the non-buyers. They voluntarily choose not to buy, and it's their decision. The reason they choose not to buy is that the value they place on the good is lower than the price they have to pay. And so they simply say, you know what, I'm not going to spend my money on that. I've got other things I can spend my money on that are a better use of my money. And so what happens here is that price creates a situation where the buyers voluntarily sort themselves into two groups, those who buy and those who don't buy. In other words, it's the price that determines who ends up with the good and who doesn't. But really, it's each individual person that makes their own decision. That's one of the nice things about a free market. A free market creates an allocation where everybody gets to make their own decision. The government doesn't tell you that you can't have it because they don't like you or because they like somebody else more or just because of some arbitrary rule. It's you that gets to make your decision. Price also causes the sellers or the potential sellers to sort themselves into two groups. So the sellers are represented along the supply curve, and the sellers with the lowest cost of production are down here, and the sellers with the higher cost of production are up here. Here's the price everybody can sell it for, and so these sellers represented between that point and this point right here, these people end up being the ones that choose to sell the good. And they sell it because they can sell it for a price that's higher than their cost of production. They can make some money selling it. These sellers right up here, between the equilibrium and this point, these potential sellers end up choosing not to sell the good. They do something different. So we'll call these people the non-sellers. They choose not to sell, not because the government told them they couldn't or because of some rule that says you can't. They just chose not to sell, and the reason is that their cost of production is higher than what they could sell it for. They would lose money if they sold it. And so they choose to do something else. And so when I describe the way a free market works with this phrase, that price allocates the good, this is what I mean. I'm not saying that price is somehow dictating to people what's going to happen. What I mean is that price is the most important signal in an economy. Price is supremely important. It creates a signal that helps you make decisions about whether or not you should buy the good or not buy it, and whether or not you should sell it or not sell it, or whether or not you should go do something else. And if you think back to your principles of microclass, you'll remember that with a free market like this, total surplus ends up getting maximized. It's a situation that's almost too good to be true. It creates the most well-being for buyers and sellers, more well-being than if the government somehow stepped in and tried to make a decision about who was going to be a buyer and who wasn't going to be a buyer. And the reason that the government fails miserably at that is the government doesn't have any information about how much we individually value the good. There's no way they could allocate the good to the people who value it the most because they don't know how much you value it. And if they ask you, you would have an incentive to be dishonest about it if you actually wanted the good. It's like having little kids and an argument where one kid says, well, I'm hungry, and another kid says, well, I'm hungrier than you are. They have an incentive to exaggerate that. And the same thing would happen, or does happen, when the government gets involved in trying to decide who's going to buy and who's going to sell. They're terrible at it. The Free market is much better. Does that mean that the free market is perfect? Well, of course not. Hopefully you remember from the principles of microclass that there are times when the outcome of a free market can be improved by government intervention. In the case of externalities, in the case of public goods. So we're not saying that it's perfect, but it is by far the best way to organize economic activity. Here's what happens with the price ceiling. What happens with the price ceiling is that the government has established a rule that doesn't allow price to allocate the good. They've created a rule that forces price to stop moving at a certain point. And what that ends up happening or creating is a situation where some other rationing mechanism has to emerge. And those other rationing mechanisms are inefficient. They are things like lines. They are things like discrimination. They are things like the underground economy, the black market. So all of those things emerge as a result of this inefficient policy that ends up creating a misallocation of resources. Now, what we need to do here is we want to talk about what happens to consumer and producer surplus. So let's do that right here. Let's put a demand curve, supply curve. I'm going to go ahead and identify the equilibrium price. If the market was allowed to actually operate freely, the price would go to right there. But let's establish a price ceiling that is binding. So let's suppose the government passes a law that says price can't go above that point. Well, then the quantity that gets transacted in the market is right here. There's going to be the quantity. And the reason we know that is because if we plug that price ceiling price into the inverse supply curve, we see the number of units that sellers are going to sell at that price. The problem is that here's the number of units that buyers are going to want to buy at that price. So right out there's the quantity demanded. But this will be the number of units that are actually available for sale. So we have a phrase in economics, we say that the short side of the market rules. And what that means is that the quantity that gets transacted is always going to be found down here on the short side of the market. Anytime you've got a price floor or a price ceiling, the short side of the market will rule. Buyers will want to buy more than that, but you can't buy a unit that doesn't exist. Now I'm going to extend this line right up here, this dotted line, to that point, and I'm going to label some areas. I'm going to call this A and B and C and D and E. Now let's take this picture and let's think about the impact on consumer and producer surplus from this price ceiling. Let's start with no price ceiling. No price ceiling. Let's start by thinking about consumer surplus. Consumer surplus is going to be the area under the demand curve and above the price. With no price ceiling, our price would be P1. And so consumer surplus would be A plus B. Now, if you were calculating this on a homework or a test, you wouldn't divide it up into these shapes. You'd just calculate the area of that triangle directly. But given the way I've set this up, these shapes we're going to be using to kind of identify areas here. But that's not how you would calculate it. Let's figure out producer surplus. Producer surplus would be the area under the price and above the supply curve. So it would be C, D, and E. C plus D plus E. And again, same thing. You wouldn't divide it up into triangles and a rectangle. You just calculate the area of this triangle directly. Now let's talk about with the price ceiling. So now the government establishes this price ceiling. Price ends up being right there. Quantity supplied ends up falling right back here to Q. And so let's start by thinking about, let's do consumer surplus first, since we did it first right there. Consumer surplus is the area under the demand curve and above the price. Now our price is right here, but remember you only go out to the quantity that gets transacted in the market. And so consumer surplus is going to be A plus C. So notice that consumers end up losing this area B and gaining this area C. We'll talk more about that here in a second. Let's first think about producer surplus. So producer surplus, because the price falls, producer surplus is the area under the price and above the supply curve. So producer surplus falls to just area E. So we can see before we do any, we don't have any numbers here, but we can easily see that producers are hurt by this, right? Producer surplus is going to fall by this area right here, area C and D. So let's just put here, producers lose C plus D. A price ceiling unambiguously hurts sellers in the market. It takes dollars right out of their pocket. This area C is a transfer. So any policy like this is typically going to have a transfer. And in this case, it's area C. C used to be part of producer surplus, but it ends up being part of consumer surplus. So any binding price ceiling has the effect of taking dollars out of the pockets of the sellers and putting them into the pockets of the buyers. It transfers wealth from one group to another for no good reason other than that the government has decided that there's going to be a price ceiling. So that's the transfer. Let's talk about the deadweight loss. So deadweight loss is the term that we use to represent the lost consumer and producer surplus because of a policy like this. So remember that consumer surplus starts out as this big triangle, producer surplus starts out as this big triangle. After we have the price ceiling, our quantity falls back to here and we lose B and D. So deadweight loss is B plus D. What that is economic well-being that just evaporates out of the economy. It is representing the economic pie getting smaller. There's less of everything to go around now. Let's talk a little bit about consumer surplus, because I've actually heard people make the argument when looking at a picture like this that if you just kind of eyeball this picture, it looks like area C is bigger than area B. Now, when we have this price ceiling, consumers lose B, but they gain C. And so it's tempting to look at that and say, oh, well, consumers are actually made better off by the price ceiling. Because in terms of consumer surplus, if we were to calculate the area of this triangle right here, and then compare it to the area of this kind of trapezoid-looking thing, I don't know what the name of that thing would be, I guarantee you the area of this will be bigger, but here's the problem with that logic. This is actually an upper bound. It's an upper bound because it would be the amount of consumer surplus if these consumers right here actually ended up consuming the good. But the problem with a price ceiling is that some other rationing mechanism emerges, things like lines, things like favoritism, discrimination. And so what ends up happening is that there's no guarantee that the consumers that value the good the most end up consuming it. Those consumers may not be at the front of the line. We could have any of these consumers represented along this portion of the demand curve. All of them have a willingness to pay that's higher than that price ceiling price. So some of these consumers down here could be at the front of the line. They're going to get very little consumer surplus. And if they're at the front of the line, in place of these consumers that would get a lot of consumer surplus, then the total amount of consumer surplus will not be A plus C. What we actually see in the real world is that once you impose a price ceiling, the total amount of consumer surplus is not as big as this picture represents, A plus C. In practice, it's actually smaller than that. So you can see that a price ceiling ends up helping some people. If you're lucky enough to know a seller and they'll sell it to you, or you're lucky enough to be able to get in a line and wait until you can get to the front of the line to get the good, you get rewarded because instead of paying this price, you get to pay that price. So it does help some people, it hurts other people. And the impact of the policy is to create deadweight loss. The economic pie shrinks. So we'd rather have less of that. There are other ways to protect buyers in a market, to protect buyers from high prices that are actually effective, that don't prohibit price from rationing the good. So in general, price ceilings are a bad idea. Let's clear this off and then we'll quickly go through a price floor and then we'll move on. Let's quickly run through what a price floor looks like. So a price floor is a legislated minimum price. So an example of that would be, the perfect example would be the minimum wage. And for a price floor to be binding, if we put our demand curve and our supply curve up here, for a price floor to be binding, it has to be set above the equilibrium. So if we were to put a price floor right there, I'm going to use P with a bar below it. If we were to put it right there, then it's going to be binding. If we set the floor down here, remember with a floor, anything above that's allowable. So here's our allowable range. So the floor is binding if the equilibrium price does not fall in the allowable range. Okay? And let me just say that sometimes, especially in a principles class, that's confusing for students because to make a floor binding, it's got to be set high. But the word floor implies that it's low. So a binding price floor is high and a binding price ceiling is low. It's the terms floor and ceiling that sometimes trick students into getting them confused. So you have to think about that a little bit. So here's our binding price floor, and what this results in is a situation where here's the quantity demanded, here's the quantity supplied, and we get a persistent surplus. And so if we were thinking about this as the market for labor, then this would be the demand for labor and the supply of labor. And a binding price floor is going to create a surplus of labor that does not go away, and a surplus of labor is the definition for unemployment. A binding minimum wage creates unemployment. Now, it only creates unemployment in the market for unskilled labor. So a minimum wage is not the source of unemployment that exists in the skilled labor market or anything like that. So we're not talking about being able to eliminate the minimum wage and eliminating all unemployment. That's of course not what we're thinking about. But in the market for unskilled labor, it certainly creates unemployment. The amount of unemployment that it creates, of course, is dependent upon how steep the supply curve and demand curve are relative to each other. It depends on the elasticity of demand and supply. And there is disagreement amongst economists. And it's also the case that the demand curve and the supply curve look different in different types of markets. And so what might a minimum wage that creates a lot of unemployment in one part of the country might not create much unemployment in another part of the country. So there's certainly room for debate about how big the impact of a minimum wage is, but it definitely creates unemployment. And the effect of that minimum wage will not go away over time. That will be persistent unemployment that exists. So let's do the same thing that we did with the price ceiling. Let's do this with the price floor and just take a look at the welfare impacts. What does it do to consumer and producer surplus? So let's put here demand and supply. Our equilibrium price we'll call P1. I'm not going to worry about the equilibrium quantity. Let's put our price floor right here. And so right there is going to be the quantity that gets transacted in the market. There's Q. If you wanted to figure this out, if you just had the functional form for the demand curve and the supply curve, or in this case the inverse demand or inverse supply curve, then you'd just plug in whatever the price floor price is into the demand curve, and that'll tell you what the quantity is that gets transacted in the market. Now let's divide these things up into some areas. Let's call this A and B and C, D, and E. And again, let me remind you that the short side of the market rules. Sellers are going to want to sell this quantity out here, and this distance between the quantity demanded and the quantity supplied, that would be the amount of the surplus. But the short side of the market rules, this will actually be the quantity that gets transacted in the market. If we were to think about no price floor, so let's start there. With no floor, our consumer surplus is A plus B plus C. Same thing as before. If you were calculating this in a problem, you'd just calculate the area of the triangle there. You wouldn't divide it up into those spaces. But it makes it easy to see on the picture if we do it this way. Our producer surplus is going to be the area under the price and above the supply curve. That's D plus E. Once we establish the price floor, so let's say with the floor, let's start with consumer surplus. Consumer surplus is the area under the demand curve and above the price. Our price is right here, so it's area A. And we can see that unambiguously a price floor hurts the buyers. Now, the justification, politicians justify price floors by saying that they want to protect sellers from low prices. And so here you can see that that policy unambiguously hurts the buyers in the market. Let's look at producer surplus. Producer surplus is going to be the area under the price and above the supply curve, but you only go out to the quantity. So we're only going to go out to this point right there. So it's going to be B plus D. Oops, B plus D. This area B is a transfer. So there's a transfer, just like we saw with the price ceiling. The transfer is area B that used to be part of consumer surplus, but it ends up as part of producer surplus. This policy takes dollars out of one group's pocket and puts it into the pocket of the other group for no good reason other than that the government has established the policy. We can see that in terms of lost consumer surplus, consumers lose B plus C. Okay? There's also deadweight loss. I'm going to abbreviate deadweight loss, DWL. Deadweight loss here is area C plus E. That's economic well-being that just vanishes out of the economy because of this policy. Same thing happens here in terms of producer surplus. Producer surplus is this kind of trapezoid looking area right there, but that's an upper bound. So let's just say here this is an upper bound. In practice, it will not actually be that big. And the reason is that this would be producer surplus if these sellers from that point there to that point there, if those were the sellers that actually sold the good, those are the most efficient sellers, the sellers with the lowest cost of production. The problem is anytime you have a price floor, some other allocation mechanism will emerge. Price will not allocate the good. And so some of these other sellers, these relatively inefficient sellers, will end up selling the good. And they won't get as much producer surplus. They will sell the good in place of some of these efficient sellers. And that's really the problem with these government policies like this, is they create inefficiencies in the market, and that causes the economic pie to shrink. So our deadweight loss is C plus E. So you can see that in terms of well-being, the economic pie shrinks with both a price floor and a ceiling. And you might ask, well, what are the better things that we could do? If we did want to somehow protect workers from low wages, or we wanted to protect buyers from high prices, what are some things that actually work that don't prohibit price from moving? Well, subsidies tend to work very well. What we want to do is we want to avoid policies that fix price, because price is the signal that goes between buyers and sellers. And if we remove that signal, then we get inefficiency. So if we want to protect buyers from high prices, we can subsidize low-income buyers, and we do. Every modern economy has some type of wage subsidies, or we could have, say, rent subsidies. We could have different types of policies that provide targeted monies to people that need them, rather than just some sweeping policy that establishes a law that doesn't allow price to move. We can actually target the people that need it. Are those perfect policies? Well, no. They get abused sometimes. They're not cheap. The government has to pay for them. But they're much better than floors and ceilings. In general, floors and ceilings are terrible policy. So what we want to do now is take a quick look at quantity regulations. So let's take a look at a quota. Quota is a policy where the government establishes a limit on the quantity. The government fixes the quantity. And what we'll see is that it has a very similar impact to a price floor or a ceiling. So this is a law that specifies the quantity to be produced. So the government chooses the quantity. This is how things have to happen in a planned economy. So if we're talking about central planning, communism, and in some cases socialism, where if the government is going to own the means of production, then the government has to decide how much of a particular good or service is going to be produced. And that means the government is picking the quantity. The government is establishing a quota. So let's take a look at the impact that this has. So let's start with a picture of the market. We've got our demand curve. We've got our supply curve. In the absence of the quota, the market would move to our equilibrium. So let's identify that equilibrium price of P1 and the equilibrium quantity of Q1. Now, a quota is a policy where instead of establishing some limit on the price, the government is going to establish a limit on the quantity. And so let's suppose that the government decides that instead of Q1, we're only going to have this quantity. I'm going to put Q with a bar above it. That'll be our quota. That's the upper limit on the quantity. And the way the government typically enforces this is that they establish permits to produce the good. So you can't produce the good unless you have a permit. That's how they choose which producers are going to actually produce it. So what ends up happening is that the supply curve becomes vertical at this quantity. If we were to extend this point right here, I'm going to grab another color here. Once the government establishes the quota, then the supply curve ceases being this line right here. The supply curve will actually be this portion of the supply curve up to the quantity, and then at that point, the supply curve becomes vertical. There's the supply curve with the quota. Anytime you have a good that's available in a fixed quantity, that means that the supply curve is vertical. It doesn't matter whether the price is up here or down here. That's the quantity that's going to be available. What this means is that if you're looking at where the supply curve intersects the demand curve, it actually with the quota intersects right up here. And so the price with the quota is going to end up being that price right there. Let's call it P. I'm going to put a little Q down here, subscript, to indicate that that's going to be the price with the quota. And then let me identify some areas. Let's call that A, B, C, D, and E. Now let's quickly just run through what the consumer and producer surplus is going to look like. So we have consumer surplus, say no quota. With no quota, the consumer surplus is going to be A plus B plus C. Producer surplus is D plus E. There's no deadweight loss with no quota. With the quota, our supply curve becomes vertical, and our price rises from P1 up to PQ. Our consumer surplus is going to fall to just area A. Because the price goes up, consumer surplus goes down. The loss of consumer surplus will be B and C. Our producer surplus is going to be B plus D. The same thing happens here as what happened with our price floor and our price ceiling, and that is that B and D are an upper bound because the government's going to choose which sellers sell the good. And it won't necessarily be these most efficient sellers. It will be the sellers that have made political donations in the past, or it will be the sellers who are in the districts of the politicians that are in control of this. It won't have anything to do with efficiency, and that is what's going to create the deadweight loss that we're going to see here in a second. So B and D, that's an upper bound on producer surplus. It won't actually be that big. Area B is a transfer. So this area used to be part of consumer surplus. It will end up being part of producer surplus. And then we're going to get deadweight loss that's equal to C plus E. So you can see that in a lot of ways, that quota ends up looking just like this price floor. It's a different policy, but it has very similar impacts. What I want to do here is stop for this video. In the next video, what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at taxes, and we're going to do a similar thing. We're going to think about the impact that a tax has on a market, and we're going to think about what happens to consumer surplus, producer surplus, and then we'll work through a problem where we just use a demand curve and a supply curve to mathematically solve for the impact of a tax. So I'll see you in that video.